The Russian forces managed to advance within the central parts of Pokrovsk, advancing to the north of the Shakhtarsky district, gain control over additional parts of the northwestern outskirts of it, leaving just a small sliver of it remaining under Ukrainian control, pushing into the apartment complex area to the north of the Shakhtarsky district and in the northeastern direction as well. In addition to this, the Russians advanced into the central parts of the city just south of the railway station and in the western parts of the city, where fighting continues everywhere in the southern parts of the railway line. Russians are looking to gain full control over the southern parts of the railway line, and according to the latest reports, significant advances are taking place in the eastern parts. More on that in the next update. These advances by the Russians in the southern parts of Pokrovsk play an important role on securing the Russian supply lines into the city. The Russians are aiming to gain full control over the railway line leading into the central parts of Pokrovsk, and with control over the highway as well, the Russians have roads that connects directly to Selidovo, the entrance of the town, as well as directly from Donetsk city to Pokrovsk, which will significantly strengthen the Russian offensive capabilities in the area. At the same time, the Russians advance to the north and northeast of Mirnorod, gaining control over the remaining parts of the industrial zone and reaching the outskirts of the city from the northeast, with an additional advance to the north of Mirnorod, where the Russians are reaching the outskirts of the settlement from the north. The Russians have reached the outskirts of Mirnorod from the north and eastern directions along the entire eastern parts of Mirnorod, except for the small area near Belahan and Promin, which remained under Ukrainian control. As for the western parts, they have control over the 20406 highway leading into the city from the west, and they have control over the highway to the south, the E50 highway, which leads into the city from the southern direction. With this, the Russians have significant control over supply lines leading into the city from the southern and western directions. At this point, the Russians aren't just matching the Ukrainian supply lines into Pokrovsk, but have actually surpassed the Ukrainian ability to supply their forces within Pokrovsk, which turns the battle over the city in the Russian favor in terms of supplies, while the terms of manpower and firepower is already significantly in favor of the Russians. It's only a matter of time before the Russians gain full control over the city. To the southwest, the Russians advance in the direction of Efilia. To the east of the settlements, gain control over a wide area as they're looking to align the front line with the highway to the south, gain control over the remaining fortifications north of Dashna, which the Ukrainians have entrenched themselves within, with an additional push through the border area between the Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk region to flank them from the east as well. The Russians are launching offensive operations to encircle the Ukrainian forces by cutting off the highway and the northern parts of the fortifications to trap the Ukrainians here in the south near Dashna, and to clear the front line to the south of Novopavlivka as the Russians continue offensive operations to push into the town from the south. Novopavlivka acts as an important logistical hub for the Ukrainian forces operating in this section of the front line. Gaining control over Novopavlivka will allow the Russians to launch offensive operations to the north, east, and southwest to support their forces in Ivanivka, in the vicinity of Moravka, and in the north towards the next logistical hub, which is Meshova, here connected to the western highway west of Pokrovsk. The Russians gain control over Pokrovsk and Meshova would allow them to move between the two sectors of the front line much more freely, with both of these cities having supply lines connected directly to the city of Donetsk. Further to the southwest, the Russians continue offensive operations along the second line of defense, where they've managed to gain control over the town of Privilya. They have advanced along the southern parts of the fortifications and the defensive line through the forest lines and roads towards Privilya, gaining control over the settlement, which cuts off the Ukrainian possessions to the south of Privilya with the ones from the north, except for the crossings across the river line. There remains 3 Ukrainian towns on the eastern bank of the Yanjur River, which is Krasnohirske, Privilya, and Pavlivka, all 3 of which are now in between Privilya to the north and Novovasilivsk to the south. With this, the Russians are going to be advancing along the river line to push towards these settlements, while at the same time the push towards Privilya is an important one, as the Ukrainians do not have any significant positions on the western bank of the Yanjur River line near Privilya, which may open up for crossings by the Russian forces across the river line, especially with the defensive line to the north, which will likely have the concentration of Ukrainian forces north of the fortifications and positions within Slahoda, where it then leaves a gap in the Ukrainian defenses here west of Privilya. Although the Russians can't entrench themselves within these first lines across the Yanjur River, it will provide the necessary cover for them to push into the residential area of Slahoda from where they can entrench themselves and establish a foothold across the river line. And there's also a disconnect between Rybne and Shlohoda here on the western bank of the river line, where the Russians can cut the connection between the two settlements by gaining control over the forest lines here in between. With this, the Russians will be looking to cross over the river line, the Yanjur river line, near Previlya into Shlohoda, and continue the advances along the second line of defense to secure the positions on the northern bank of the Yanjur River, as well as a foothold across from the northern parts of the first defensive line. It is difficult for the Russians to advance further northwards from Poltavka following the capture of the settlement, as the Ukrainians have the defensive lines here along the first line of defense in the Zaporizhia region. They have a difficulty pushing through the Yanjur River in between these settlements here north of the defensive line, as it is a large concentration of these settlements, which makes it difficult for them to push across the river line. Therefore, finding the gap here in the north is important for the Russians to establish themselves on both banks of the river line and still bypass the fortifications by flanking them from the rear. Moving on further south along the front line, we see that there has been several developments in favor of the Russians along the Dnieper River. Here we see that the developments taken are from a long period of time, from January of this year all the way to now. So it's been taking 10 months for the Russians to make these advances along the Dnieper River and in the islands in between the southern and northern parts of the Kherson region. Starting out near Novokhovka, the Russians have managed to gain control over the eastern island here, with the forest patches providing cover for Russian forces operating within the Dnieper River here along the Novokhovka crossing across the Dnieper River. The Russians have been working on these islands to prevent another Ukrainian crossing across it and to prepare for their own future crossing to gain control over the entirety of the Kherson region, which is one of the war goals of the Russians. To the west of this, the Russians have managed to gain control over additional islands here in between the southern and northern banks of the river line, getting control over some of these forest patch areas, while the bridge itself is destroyed. On the second stretch here, the first stretch is still intact, and the Russians are securing the positions in the vicinity of it. This is to prevent the Ukrainians from making use of the cover of the bridge to cut the distance they have to cross over the Dnieper River in the open, while the Russians in turn can make use of it to establish their own positions. The objective of the Russians is also to gain control over any residential area within these islands to prevent the Ukrainians from making use of them to entrench themselves and cross across the river line. To the southwest of this, the Russians have reached the southern outskirts of Kherson. Here along the islands, gain control over some of these dacha areas here in the islands in between the northern and southern parts. And they have also blown up all of the bridges into the southern parts of Kherson, where they are trying to isolate this entire area. It has already been evacuated from civilians by the Ukrainians, and with this, the Russians are constantly attacking any Ukrainian military position within this area and starving it out to empty it out for any future Russian crossing across the river line. They would be entering into this part to establish themselves and create a crossing, a foothold across the Dnieper River line into the city itself would likely come from here. With the fighting taking place in the islands here in between, the Russians are gaining control over the dacha area and the ports. To gain control over both banks of the river line, they need to establish themselves first in the southern parts. They've also managed to gain control over the dacha area here near the Dnieper River to the south of the Dnieper River, getting full control over the dacha area and a foothold within the northern island. As for the southwest, they've managed to gain control over several of the islands that enter into the Dnieper River from the Black Sea. This is again to establish themselves in these islands, preventing Ukrainian attacks across it and preparing for their own future offensive operations through the river line. The remaining frontline updates will be taking place in the next update, where we'll cover the developments that happened within Kupiansk and the eastern bank of the river line near Kupiansk within Vovchansk and the Liman section of the front line, as well as additional advances within Pokrovsk. Stay tuned for the next update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.